Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Benefit Then Stop, Mohism and Impartial Care. The modern-day philosopher Peter Singer has proposed a striking thought experiment designed to get us to think about the responsibilities we owe to complete strangers. He asks you to imagine that you are on your way to work, wearing a nice suit and new shoes, when you see a child drowning in a pond. Presumably, you would not hesitate to wade in to help the child, even at the cost of ruining your clothes. Why then do we hesitate to do something equivalent, namely donating to charity the amount of money it would cost to buy a suit and shoes, if this would save the life of a child who is starving or sick, but located on the other side of the world? The argument calls attention to an apparent irrationality in our moral behavior. We instinctively respond to need, but only if it is near at hand. People who are out of sight are also out of mind, and we feel little or no compunction about letting them suffer when we could help. The argument is compelling, but in its fuller implications also potentially disturbing. Singer is a utilitarian, meaning that he thinks that we have a duty within our means to try to make the world better for everyone, for all those who have interests that could be satisfied or go unsatisfied. The everyone doesn't even need to be human. He has been a prominent advocate for vegetarianism and animal welfare more generally. But even if you restrict your attention to your fellow humans, you can see that this moral theory may make very heavy demands on you. How can you justify paying to put your child through college, or even buying her a birthday present, if the money it would cost could help save the life of someone else's child? This has always been a challenge for utilitarians, or to speak more broadly, consequentialists. Consequentialism being the name for a whole family of ethical theories that tell us to measure the moral value of our actions or standing policies by the consequences that result from them. Within the European context, consequentialism is usually taken to go back as far as the utilitarians of the 18th and 19th centuries like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Singer was well aware of his debt to these thinkers, acknowledging Bentham in his 1975 book, Animal Liberation. Generations earlier, Bentham had already remarked that when it comes to animals, the question is not whether they can reason or talk, but whether they can suffer. Had Singer looked beyond Europe, and a couple of thousand years earlier, instead of a couple of centuries earlier, he might have acknowledged another precedent for his consequentialist philosophy. In fact, he could have discovered that even his argument about the drowning girl was not original. You probably think we mean Mengzi's famous example of the child about to fall into a well, but actually we have in mind the Mozi, which uses the same example to make a point much closer to Singer's. Given that a mother would save her child from drowning in a well, why don't the rulers help when the people are starving to death? Actually, once you have read the Mozi, you may conclude that modern consequentialists, from Bentham to Singer, were, to use the sort of craft analogy so beloved of the Mohists, simply reinventing the wheel. As we saw last time, the Mohists tell us to apply a kind of test to any action or type of action. Does it produce benefit for people? Such things as extravagant funerals and musical performances fail the test, so they should be eliminated. They even apply their test to the building of houses, in lines that will incidentally remind us of our discussion of women in ancient Chinese society. The Mozi says that houses should have walls and foundations sturdy enough to keep out the weather and enough space to allow for segregation of the sexes. The passage then concludes by urging, only this, then stop. To go further, whether by building a grand palace or just adding some ornamentation to your otherwise humble dwelling, would be a waste of scarce and precious resources. Mohism seems then to be a dramatic anticipation of modern consequentialism, and has usually been treated as such. Later in this episode, we're going to consider an objection to that way of seeing the movement, but at the risk of spoiling the tension, we think this objection can be answered. So we do think the Mohists were consequentialists. But, as we've said, consequentialism is a broad family of moral theories, so we should be more specific. It seems hard to believe, for instance, that these austere social critics were also anticipating Bentham and Mill by saying that the consequence to aim at would be pleasure. We find that kind of hedonist consequentialism elsewhere in the ancient world, actually, amongst the Epicureans, but that's another story. Happily, the Mozi is crystal clear on the kinds of goods it has in mind, namely wealth, increased population, and social order. These, and not pleasure, are the criteria they use to measure well-being. To increase these three things is to pursue what they call benefit. As we also said last time, the Chinese term for this is li, which is rather confusing because it sounds the same as the word for ritual that was so important in Confucianism, but this is a different word with a different character in written Chinese. Their choice of items to place under this heading is already a clue to a distinctive feature of Mohist consequentialism. They are focused on goods that belong to the whole community, more than on goods that belong to one person at a time, so that their theory can be designated as a sort of social morality. No less than the Confucian thinker Xunzi, they are determined that society should be well-ordered. And when they speak of wealth, they obviously don't have in mind the kind of ostentatiously aristocratic behavior involved in spending fortunes on luxury ceremonial vases. Rather, they want to ensure that the common people are supplied with the basic necessities of life, that everyone has those humble dwellings for shelter and enough food to avoid starving. As for a sizable population, this may seem a more surprising candidate for a crucial benefit, but the Mohists are very serious about their family planning policy. They tell us that the sage kings required men and women to marry at a relatively early age, a policy aimed at doubling the number of their subjects. Conversely, the strict mourning practices endorsed by the Confucians are criticized for, among other things, preventing the mourners from having sex, with the result that fewer children are born. In any case, a large population is taken to be an intrinsic social good. Presumably, the Mohists are thinking of the larger workforce that results, rather than of the increase in the number of mouths to feed. Another distinctive feature of Mohist ethics is its stress on the idea of impartiality. They frequently cite the principle jian, which is also the topic of one of the triads of the core text of the Mozi. It used to be fashionable to translate jian as universal love, but nowadays a rendering along the lines of inclusive care is usually preferred. And rightly so, because love seems to imply a greater degree of emotional commitment than the Mohists would want. As consequentialists, they direct our attention to results, not to inner attitudes like feelings of attachment. In fact, it has been argued that the jian principle is intended to counteract our natural tendency to care only for those with whom we share an emotional bond, like our own family and friends. The practice of jian involves caring for others as one cares for oneself, and the Mozi criticizes those who prioritize special relational bonds, as that approach encourages partiality, in Chinese, biais. While both the Analects and the Mozi praise airen, caring for other people, the Confucians and Mohists understand this in different ways. For the Confucians, moral life begins with the bonds developed within the family. These are then nurtured into the virtue of xiao, filial piety, which is then further extended to become the general virtue of ren, benevolence. For the Mohists, by contrast, those very same emotional bonds might be a threat because they can lead us to ignore the needs of other people. Why save people from starving when you could get your beloved daughter a nice gift, like perhaps a massive ceremony with 8 rows of dancers and an opulent feast of meats flavored with delicate spices, all enjoyed to the resonating sounds of expensively cast bronze bells? Young Sun Bak has thus written that Mozi considered the inner emotional state of human beings, such as filial affection, parental affection, fraternal affection, and friendship, to be a hindrance to the successful practice of care. If this is right, and the ethic of inclusive care pulls against our natural tendency to prefer those who are close to us, then how can we imagine that it would ever become widely adopted? This isn't necessarily a devastating objection. Peter Singer presumably knows that most Americans aren't going to become generously charitable vegetarians within his lifetime, but that hasn't stopped him from arguing for it. Yet, the Mohists are at pains to show that their program is feasible. In one passage, they imagine a critic saying that it would be no easier to get people to adopt inclusive care than to pick up Mount Tai, a sacred mountain, or to jump over a river. They reply that equally momentous changes have been worked in the past, especially by the sage kings. Remember Yu, the emperor who worked the hair off his legs setting up irrigation projects? The Mozi mentions him as an example, and in another passage points out that the other kings have gotten people to alter their behavior dramatically, as by changing their diet, risking their lives in battle, or wearing uncomfortable clothing. Such transformations can be carried out within just a single generation. With wise and inspiring leadership, the same could happen with inclusive care, especially given the wonderful results that lie in store for the society that manages the feat. Inclusion is the way of the sage kings, that by which kings, dukes, and great men achieve peace, and that by which the myriad people achieve sufficiency in clothing and food. But if inclusive care is possible, is it really desirable? Again, showing a flair for striking thought experiments, the Mohists responds to this question by offering what is sometimes called the caretaker argument. Imagine a man is going away on a long trip. He needs someone to care for the members of his household. Whom will he choose? Someone who exercises inclusive care, or someone who does not? In this situation, the passage asserts, there are no foolish men or foolish women in the world. In other words, everyone would be sensible enough to appoint someone who is willing to care for a family that is not his own. One thing we learn from this argument is that the Mohists were not, as is sometimes claimed, justifying inclusive care on the somewhat ironic grounds of self-interest. In other words, they were not depending on the claim that each of us would individually be better off if everyone would start caring for everyone else. After all, the caretaker argument assumes that the traveler is pursuing not his own individual self-interest, but the interest of his family. Insofar as self-interest is relevant here, that would have to include the interests of those who are dear to oneself. But hang on a second. Weren't the Mohists precisely saying that we should set aside the interests of ourselves and of our friends and family, looking instead to the interests of all? Certainly, this is what at least some of their contemporaries thought. As we'll see next time, Confucians polemicized against the Mohists for being so impartial in their care that they violated the moral duties that arise from partiality. For instance, the duty to look after your own father more than you would look after other people's fathers. This worry continues to bother scholars in the present. As David Wong has commented, if the Mohists cannot do justice to our intuition that we do have special reasons to prioritize the benefit of our families and friends over the benefit of total strangers, then their moral theory becomes simply irrelevant because no one would ever be willing to live by it. This is a version of the concern we raised at the start of this episode about Singer's drowning child argument. While it seems plausible that you should ruin your outfit to pull an unrelated child from the pond, it doesn't seem so plausible that you should give your own child nothing more than basic sustenance and use every resource that remains to supply sustenance to people you've never met. As we've said, one could bite the bullet here and say that even if people are in fact unlikely to rise to the demands of a thoroughgoing consequentialism, they still ought to do so. But this is not how the Mohists respond to the problem. To the contrary, they seem to agree with the Confucians that filial piety is important and valuable. Indeed, they exploit our antecedent commitment to such feelings of devotion when they are arguing for their theory. The caretaker argument is an example. The traveler should prefer an inclusively caring caretaker because the traveler wants his family to prosper in his absence. In a similar passage, the Mohists explicitly considers the objection that inclusive care is inconsistent with filial piety. It answers that if you really care about your own parents, you should be willing to take care of other people's parents because this will encourage other people to do the same for yours. Here again, it is simply taken for granted that we all already value the welfare of our family members, and that we're not going to stop doing that no matter what philosophical arguments may come along. So, the Mohists are not trying to convince us to abandon filial devotion for the sake of inclusive care, but to convince us that the two are perfectly compatible. In fact, the Mohists actually cites a decline in filial piety as a sign of the disorder that results when people stop caring about each other. Sons care about themselves and don't care about their father, so they injure their father to benefit themselves. Not unlike Confucian benevolence, then, inclusive care seems to include filial piety. The upshot is that there would probably not be much difference between the actual practice of Mohists and Confucians when it comes to the treatment of their own families. If they did diverge, it would happen because of moral dilemmas, like the ones mentioned in the Analects and the Mohists, where sons face the choice of whether to cover up for crimes committed by their fathers. Here, the Confucians say yes. As we saw, Mohists claims that the sage king Shun would have abdicated to carry his father off to a remote territory so as to save him from a murder charge. A Mohist would probably tell Shun to reconsider. There are conflicting considerations here between filial piety and the demands of justice, so Shun should weigh these with an eye to benefit. Perhaps the question should be settled by reflecting on all the good that Shun could do for the people by staying on the throne, rather than fleeing with his murderous dad. For the most part, though, we can imagine that, especially for everyday people who are not in any position to produce benefit for all who live under heaven, inclusive care would require no extensive or counterintuitive changes in their behavior. This rather deflationary point is one that has been made by several scholars of Mohism. Chris Fraser writes that their view is, at most, only moderately more demanding than what many people today would consider simple moral decency, while Dan Robbins thinks that caring for everyone is consistent with benefiting only those you encounter directly, like the child you see drowning in the pond or the family for whom you've been appointed a caretaker. This would help make it more plausible that inclusive care is something that could be established across society in relatively short order. Now let's consider one final objection, the one we had in mind earlier when we mentioned that Mohism might not be a form of consequentialism after all. Certainly, they do keep pointing us towards consequences and often seem to treat them as the only decisive consideration, as when the Mozi says about music, does it benefit people? Then do it. Does it not benefit people? Then stop. But, as we said in the previous episode, they also pose another question, one that looks just as decisive. What does heaven intend for us to do? For example, Mozi also says, and this may sound familiar, what heaven desires, do it. What heaven doesn't desire, stop. It's clear enough that heaven intends whatever is beneficial, and that whatever is beneficial is what heaven intends. What's less clear is which of these is fundamental. As we also said in the previous episode, this problem is reminiscent of the Euthyphro dilemma, named after a Platonic dialogue in which it is asked whether the gods love things because they are pious, or vice versa. If the Mohists think that heaven intends things because they are beneficial, then they really are consequentialists. If it is the other way around, and benefit is worth pursuing simply because heaven intends it, then the Mohists are espousing a different position, one that philosophers would now call a divine command theory. Unfortunately, it's not easy to tell from the Mozi which answer is the right one, or whether there is even a consistent answer across the text. Remember that it was apparently written in stages, with the second and third elements of the triads in the court chapters possibly revising what comes in the first. If the Mohists were to tell us that inclusive care would no longer be right if heaven had decided not to intend it, this would clearly establish that they are divine command theorists, but they don't say anything to this effect. That silence might be taken as a piece of evidence in its own right. If the Mohists cannot even conceive of heaven intending anything but benefit, this may be because benefit is indeed ethically fundamental. Dirk Vorenkamp, who prefers this reading, puts the point as follows. In the final analysis, heaven is incidental to this ethical system because the final rationale justifying heaven's decree is the utility criterion. A subtle suggestion along these general lines has been put forward by Bradford Jean Hyuk Kim. His proposal is that heaven's intent and benefit are basically the same thing, except that heaven's intent is oriented towards the past, since it can be grasped by seeing how good people have been rewarded and bad ones punished. Benefit, by contrast, is prospective and future-facing because it is a criterion for deciding what results to produce. Though this is a difficult interpretive issue, we do take the Mohists to be genuine consequentialists and not divine command theorists. They envision heaven as a kind of deity who intervenes in human lives. That's in stark contrast to what we saw in Mengzi and Xunzi, for whom heaven is more an impersonal force that might be identified with fate. Still, there's never any suggestion that this deity might be arbitrarily determining the moral laws. Furthermore, we cannot help but be struck by the similarity between the Mozi's appeals to heaven and its talk of the sage kings. In some passages, it might even seem that we should adopt inclusive care, be frugal in expenditure, avoid warfare, and so on, simply because this is how the sage kings ruled. But no one would think the sage kings were deciding what is morally right and wrong. Of course, heaven outranks the sage kings. Presumably, they would themselves have seen it as a standard. Yet the parallel is a striking one. The function of heaven is like that of the sage kings. Both, through their ways of ruling, give us information about what they perceive to be right, not what they have dictated to be right. So now we should have a pretty good grasp of the overall outlines of the moral theory found in the Mozi. We've already seen in this episode that its theories make for a striking contrast with those of the Confucians, and this did not escape the attention of Confucian authors. In fact, they polemicized against the Mohists, even coupling Mozi with the supposedly self-interested hedonist Yang Tzu as a pernicious influence on society, despite the fact that the philosophical positions of these two men seem diametrically opposed. So, what is the case for Confucianism in response to Mohism, and how might the Mohists respond? To find out, don't stop listening to the history of philosophy in China.